We're now going to look at Byzantine art in Italy. And Byzantine art was extremely influential on Italian art. In fact, what we call the Italo-Byzantine style is the style that lasts right up to the Renaissance or to the late Gothic period, when greater naturalism comes in with Cavallini and Giotto and Duccio and people like that in the 14th century. But we're not going to look at that. We're going to look at some of the Byzantine medieval images in Italy. And the first thing we're going to look at was a new discovery. Now, it's not brand new, but it was discovered in the 20th century, about 1945. This was in a little church dedicated to Mary that was kind of out in the woods in Castelseprio, which is near Milan. And it wasn't even known to be there. And, someone stumbles upon it and realizes that these images that are on the walls of the church are just very important. The church seems to be a 7th century church, perhaps, although the dating, as you can see, of the frescoes becomes very controversial. These are frescoes of the infancy of Christ, the childhood of Christ. And we're using the date of circa 700, but the date has been very controversial. People have estimated everything from the 6th century, which is probably a bit early, to as late as the 10th century. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot of literature you could read. Try to decide for yourself. And we also have Greek inscriptions on the walls. Now, this is Italy. This is in the West, where you would expect to see Latin inscriptions. So that immediately suggests that the person making the inscriptions comes from Byzantium. The images are actually very amazing. These are frescoes, they're not mosaics, and they are painterly, they are lively, spontaneous. The figures have these extremely active poses. You can see here the dream of St. Joseph, and the angel is really flying in at a diagonal. The paint has some shading. It also has delicate hues. And if you look at it, you see both the linear and the shading. Of course, with fresco, with paint, you could more easily shade. So you have a lot of line, but at the same time, everything seems to be extremely active. Now, the quality of these images is extremely high. This seems to be a painter who has what we call virtuosity, a very skilled painter. And one of the theories is that this could have been a Byzantine painter fleeing iconoclasm. And so, there's no use for very many painters in Byzantium now, because starting in 726 to 843, that this is the period of the iconoclastic controversy when images are banned. We have this date of 700, perhaps it was a little later, and a very skilled artist has to leave the Byzantine Empire and comes to Italy, where he can still practice his profession, even if it is small churches. There are other ideas. One idea is that this is an artist of the Macedonian Renaissance who has been exposed to manuscript paintings that have more classical illusionism, and that would explain why they're so dynamic. You'll notice, however, they are very elongated figures. And then there is also the idea that maybe it's not a Byzantine artist, maybe it is a Western artist who is following Byzantine models and comes out of as early as the 8th century or the 9th century. We're going to talk about Carolingian art, which is art of the time of Charles the Great, Charlemagne, and his successors, which is 8th and 9th centuries. And there are some manuscripts and rems that are very dynamic. Doesn't seem to me to be that, just looking at the style. But let's go back and look at each one of these images. We see here the presentation in the temple. And certainly there's a lot of damage that's been done. The plaster has disintegrated in places. But you have, sort of the very free brushwork and colors, and a sense perhaps of space where Mary turns, Simeon leans over, and there is a kind of alcove, an architectural feature behind them. The dynamism is seen even more in things like the Dream of Joseph, where the angel just zooms in and imparts this dream to Joseph. And I think you can see here there's linearity, but there's also some shading. When we look at the Adoration of the Magi, you have these very elongated magi, but notice how they turn in space. You see the back of one, the side of another, the front of another. This is a real spatial concept. And then Mary is placed on a higher level with the little Christ child looking down, and an angel, once again, on the diagonal. And so you have this wonderful swooping movement leading up to the Christ child, where the Magus offers the gift. And the child leans down, and the angel's body parallels that movement. It's a wonderfully sophisticated composition with both the naturalistic elements of shading and figures that can turn in space, and also, of course, elongation and linearity. It does seem to be a Byzantine artist. I think most people would agree with that. A Byzantine artist who has come west. And you see, of course, the flight into Egypt here. Undoubtedly, the most famous example of Byzantine architecture in the West is the Church of San Marco in Venice, or St. Mark's in English, dedicated, of course, to St. Mark, whose remains were believed to have been brought from Alexandria to Venice and reside under the altar. And so St. Mark is the patron saint of Venice, and very often you will see the lion of St. Mark as a symbol of Venice. Now, this is essentially a Byzantine-style church that is constructed on Western soil. So the arrangements of the mosaics will be in Western fashion, although the style will be Byzantine. And I should also point out that when you're looking at the facade, you have these ogee arches with little pinnacles and statuary at the top. And this is perhaps a little bit of Gothic ornamentation added. But primarily this is, as I said, a Byzantine-style church built on Western soil. It was begun in the year 1063, so 11th century onward. And you can see that the original structure was a Greek cross plan with 5 domes, largest dome in the center, raised up, and then on each of the cross arms there was another dome. This Greek cross plan imitates Justinian's Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. Of course, that church was destroyed in the 15th century. And then they put additions, which we'll take a look at some of the mosaics in there, which become a kind of elaborate narthex out on the front. So we go into San Marco and we see these beautiful golden mosaics that completely cover the surface of the interior. The mosaics are in Byzantine style, linear, stylized, elongated. but the arrangement of them may not be identical to a Byzantine church. We often say that in the Western church, the images on the walls are arranged in a more narrative fashion or a more chronological fashion. But we only have certain details to show you here. We're looking up into one of the domes, and you can see how the dome appears to float on pendentives, and portrayed on the pendentives are these angels, which of course are heavenly beings. Here we're looking at the Ascension Dome. In the center, at the top, we see Christ in a roundel, seated on a rainbow with stars behind him. Now that's a very interesting image because that reminds us of the way the Last Judgment is shown in Western art. Christ seated on the rainbow. And you will remember that in Acts of the Apostles, the angel says to the apostles, "Men of Galilee, why are you looking up to heaven? Don't you know that Christ will come again as he went?" So they're borrowing, as you might say, imagery that reminds us of the Last Judgment, of a second coming of Christ, and applying that here. You can also see the apostles standing between these trees, which suggests, of course, it is an outdoor setting. So now we need an indoor setting. And here is the Pentecost dome. You look up into the dome, and you see the rays of light coming from the Holy Spirit. And they are going directly down to the seated apostles. And of course, this will give them the power to be able to speak different languages and to go out and to preach to all the world, also known as the descent of the Holy Spirit. And just some details, give you some different views and show you how the light shines in. Okay, now we're going to go into that narthex. And we're going to look at a very interesting and very important dome. One of these many domes that are the ceiling of the narthex is what is called the Genesis dome, because it has scenes from the story of Genesis. And what is particularly interesting is that we believe that this is copied from an early Christian Bible. Because the iconography is so similar to a Bible that once existed. Some of the pictures were copied, but is now burnt. And so we think they may have had a common source. And so this gives us information not just about mosaic working in the West in the Byzantine tradition, but images that go much further back, possibly 4th or 5th century, possibly 4th century manuscript. And you see all of these different scenes of the mosaics. There's a little black and white picture, a detail from the mosaic of Genesis at San Marco on the right. And on the left is a picture of a copy that was made of an image from what we call the Cotton Genesis. It was in Mr. Cotton's collection. Only in, I believe, the 17th century, there was a fire, and his collection was destroyed, including what we believe was the earliest surviving illustrated Bible manuscript, which was a Genesis. And since the iconography is so similar, we think that both of these go back to probably a 4th century manuscript. And we can get some idea of what it might have contained by looking at this. So you can see here what we're talking about. We have an image of Christ with a nimmed halo, and he is that beardless, youthful Christ. This is Christ as Logos, or Verbum, Christ as the Word. And of course, it was the Word that was made flesh and dwelt among us, as St. John says. So that identifies Christ with the Word of God. And of course, when God spoke, it was created. So here we see Christ creating. Remember, he is co-eternal with the Father. The mortal part, when he became man, has a beginning in history. But Christ himself is co-eternal with the Father, his spiritual being. So we see him on the third day of creation, creating the plants. And you see these little figures that look like angels next to him. There's 3 of them, and they seem to be the personification of the days of creation. And we see those both in the Cotton Genesis and on the Genesis mosaic at San Marco. And then all these wonderful little stylized trees. You might notice at San Marco, we've got some of those umbrella trees that I pointed out to you from the Vienna Genesis. So this seems to be an early Christian tree motif. As you can see, the scenes are in concentric circles going around the dome, would fit the dome. You could probably imagine them either in a scroll, where you had a continuous scene, or in a codex, where they are separated on the different pages. But we'll just take a look at some of these. Here is the Logos separating light and darkness. The creation of the animals. And you have the animals being created on earth, and the animals being created in the sea, all of those fishes. And in the air, above the fishes are flying the birds. We also see the story of Adam and Eve. Here you see God taking the rib from Adam, and of course he will create Eve with that. And here it looks like he's kind of pushing Eve toward Adam. He's introducing Eve to Adam. I've created a helpmate for you. And down below you see the expulsion, where instead of an angel with a fiery sword, it looks like Christ is pushing Adam and Eve out. They're now wearing clothing, and Eve is spinning and Adam is delving. They have to earn their bread, their livelihood, by the sweat of their brow. One of the great treasures of San Marco is the Pala d'Oro, the golden altarpiece, which is from the early 12th century. And this is created with gold and enamel, and it came from Constantinople. Some of the treasures of San Marco were not commissioned for San Marco. They were literally stolen, pillaged from Constantinople in 1204 by the Crusaders. In 1204 was the Fourth Crusade, and the Western Crusaders were going to the Holy Land to try to retake the places of Christ's life from, as they saw it, the infidel. Only they didn't make it there on the Fourth Crusade. They were in Venetian vessels, and they stopped in Constantinople, where the gates were open to them as fellow Christians. And they looked around, and they said, why go all the way to the Holy Land? This place is rich. And they decided to sack Constantinople. They slaughtered people pretty much indiscriminately. There's a famous line. Someone asks, well, how can I tell who are Christians and who are, Jews or Muslims, infidel, as they would see? And the reply is, kill them all. God will know his own. So they sacked Constantinople, and they brought back many relics and many treasures from Constantinople to Western Europe. Among these treasures was, and you may have seen a picture of this, I don't have a picture here, but there are 4 bronze horses over the entrance of San Marco. And they're just associated with San Marco. They're shown in many, many pictures. Those were from Constantinople. So was the Pala d'Oro. So we are looking at Byzantine work, not Western work. Let's look at this detail. It shows you Christ in majesty in this Byzantine enamel and gold, and it's a technique known as cloisonne. Cloisonne is colored enamels in metal cells. And so you have thin strips of metal or wires that create little cavities or cells, and they are soldered to a metal base. And then you place glass powder or pastes within these little cells, and you heat them, you bake them, and they turn liquid, and then of course they cool, and that is the enamel. This forms the antependium, or the part that hangs down in front of the altar. This is of course made up of different pieces put together. It's not one solid piece. So we're not sure that the pieces were arranged the way they are now. They say that the present configuration dates to the 14th century. Here's another detail where you're seeing one of the angels. And you can see how intricate and detailed this enamel work is. Not only enamel work is used in the Pala d'Oro, but also gems. The surface is encrusted with, you can see pearls here, for example, with different gemstones. Also, you should realize that these types of enamels can be used for other purposes. It's not just for an antependium. You could put them together and create a reliquary or a pyx, or to decorate other surfaces. A reliquary, of course, is the container for a relic, the remains of a sacred person, for example, or something that came in contact with that saint. A pyx is a little box in which you would carry the consecrated host. And here you have a detail, and you can see there we have our angel and all of these little roundels containing the heads of saints. We're now going to move from Venice in the north of Italy to the south, to Sicily, and look at Byzantine art in Sicily. Sicily was Byzantine territory until the Muslim encroachment of the mid-9th century, but that didn't last. In the 11th century, between 1060 and 1091, Roger of Normandy conquers Sicily. Now, you know that Normandy is today part of France. It's northern France. And you may remember that in 1066, William of Normandy conquered England, the Norman conquest. So the Normans were out conquering a lot in the 1060s, as you can see. In 1130, Roger II of Holver, who is the nephew of the Roger I, united all of the Norman conquests in Italy. And Roger II was crowned king of Sicily, Apulia, and Calabria. This was called the Norman Empire, or the Norman Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. It was claimed by both the Western and the Byzantine empires. And of course, Palermo was the capital. One thing that's very interesting about this is that you have Western rulers, Norman rulers, coming in to an area that has a very strong Byzantine tradition. And so what we're going to see is a combination of Western and Eastern traditions united in the art and in the architecture. What you're looking at here is the Cappella Palatina, or the Palace Chapel in Palermo, built between 1132 and 1140. And as you can see, Roger has had the Palace Chapel created as a Western basilica, as the Latin basilica. In other words, a longitudinal church, which is what was common in the West. But there is also a mixture with the Byzantine tradition in the naos, or the nave, right in front of the apse. You have a domed Greek cross in square, naos. You also have the surfaces decorated with mosaics. And we believe that many of these artisans may even have come from Constantinople. So you have this feeling, this idea of the Byzantine cosmos in the sanctuary and in the transepts. But then when you get to the nave, where you have a direction, a longitudinal axis, you start to see this narrative tradition. You're showing the scenes chronologically from Old Testament to New Testament down the walls of the nave. So east meets west. As we look up to the dome, we see a Christ Pantocrator, the same type of Christ Pantocrator that we've seen before, for example, at Daphne. So we're talking about here, 12th century art. These are roughly contemporary. Daphne's a little bit earlier, but 12th century images. Here you can see that Christ is surrounded with angels who come quite close to the central roundel of Christ Pantocrator. He doesn't look to me quite as frightening as the Daphne Christ, perhaps. Same iconographic type, however. And here we're looking at some of the other images that are on the walls. You can see an image of the Nativity and of the entry into Jerusalem. So let's take a closer look. Here we have the Nativity at Palermo, and we're contrasting it with the Nativity at Daphne, which would be just a little bit earlier. But there are some very similar traditions. Now the placement is quite different. Daphne, you have the theophanies in the pendentives. With the Western tradition, you have on the walls of the church a narrative that's more chronological, or if you want to think of things happening in historical order. So that's different. But as you can see, many of the traditions are very similar. We see some of the very same things rearranged. Okay, let's see. We see Mary on this big poofy cushion. Now here she's seated upright, and she's actually placing the Christ child in the manger. But the child is swaddled, and the manger looks very similar. It's this kind of box shape. Images we think of sarcophagi and Christ giving his life. We think of the altar on which Christ's crucifixion is reenacted. And of course there is the ox and the ass ready to warm Christ with their breath. You can see that Mary is in front of a cave, the grotto of the Nativity. You see these sort of jagged edges of the opening that she completely fills it up. And there is Joseph off to the side. I don't want to say he's looking useless, he's not, but he's not participating quite as much. He is not Christ's actual father. He's seated off to the side, sort of watching what's going on. Now, there are some other scenes happening here. We do have an angel, and the angel, you see up in the upper right corner, the angel is pointing, and around the corner, I believe, we would probably find the shepherds. So this is actually taking place. They have to turn the corner and come into that scene. We see here something we do not see at Daphne. We see the three Magi arriving, and here the angels are behind the Magi rather than directly behind the little mountain, the little hill that has the cave of the Nativity. And then down below we see the washing of the baby. So Christ is shown twice. The midwives are about to wash the newborn Christ child. Was this once in the damaged, destroyed corner at Daphne? It may very well have been. We can't say. But certainly those images of the midwives continue in art. We see them very, very frequently in Byzantine art and in Western art. That even when it becomes much more classical and illusionistic in the Renaissance and the period previous to the Renaissance, the late Gothic period, we often do see the midwives shown. The story of the midwives, of course, is in the Proto-Evangelium, or the Gospel of St. James. This is another apocryphal gospel. It's not part of the canonical Bible, but the stories were widely believed and found their way into art. And it says that, when Mary is ready to give birth to the Christ child, Joseph goes in search of a midwife. And he comes back with 2 midwives and finds that Mary has already given birth. And Mary, I guess, explains to them that she was a virgin and it was a miraculous birth as well as a miraculous conception. And one of the midwives believes, and the other says, I don't believe it. I'm going to check it out. And what essentially they're talking about, that she extends her hand. Presumably she's going to check and see if Mary still has a hymen. It doesn't say that, it implies it. And her hand withers. And of course she's horrified, and Mary says, touch the child, and the midwife touches the child and her hand is healed, and she believes in the miraculous birth of Christ. So the midwives are a frequent element in art. And here we're seeing the entry into Jerusalem. And I'm comparing this from a mosaic in San Marco in Venice. The point being, of course, that many of the same traditions, sometimes a little bit rearranged, appear throughout Byzantine art. So in Palermo, we've got a little bit more movement. It looks like Christ is riding down a hill to Jerusalem. In Venice, he is riding straight across. And in both cases, the apostles follow him. They're reduced in number. There's sort of 3 of them, I guess, to suggest all 12. But we have a whole crowd in Palermo. And some of them you can only just see the tippy tops of their halos. They're overlapped. In Palermo, you see the city gates of Jerusalem and the people pouring out. Since this image is cut off, I don't know, I would guess that you would probably see the city gates at San Marco as well. But here we have people who have already exited, and they're standing waiting for Christ. There's a big palm tree in both cases. In the case at San Marco, there's somebody climbing up the palm tree. I think we've talked about that a bit. And then you see they appear to be little children or small people taking off their clothes right in front of the colt in San Marco. And in Venice, they have already taken off their cloaks and placed them on the ground. And as you can see, the equine, the donkey or the colt, has placed one hoof on each robe that has been thrown before to honor Christ. So you can do some variations and you can fit the space available, but there are certainly some traditions that continue. You might notice that Peter is pretty predominantly placed in Palermo. He is right beside Christ, just behind the donkey. At Venice, he seems to be the first person behind the donkey. And I think that young man behind him would then be St. John. And here, just one more image of Abraham and the angels at the Cappella Palatina. And this likewise is an image that you have seen before. The angels seated at a table and Abraham serving them. There's a little scene that you haven't seen. Here he is really down, making proskinesis. He's prostrate on the ground before the angels. At this point, he seems to have recognized them as messengers of God, as angels, rather than just as strangers to whom he must extend hospitality. But as you can see, many of the traditions just continue on through the centuries. There were other churches built in Norman Sicily. One was the cathedral at Cefalu. And if you look at the plan, you just say, oh yes, that's Norman architecture. It has a longitudinal plan. It has no dome, but then they're decorating it with Byzantine mosaics. So the hierarchy of Byzantine mosaics has to be adapted to the Western church design. And here we see an image of Cefalu from the front. And then as we go into it, and of course some of these decorations are definitely later, what we're going to look at is the apse. Now remember, I said we do not have a dome. So where are you going to place the Christ Pantocrator? Will you place it in the next highest, most sacred spot, which is the apse of the church, directly over the altar where all the focus is going? And when you get into the church, you enter at the western end and you can look right down to the eastern end, to the altar and to the image of Christ Pantocrator as it hovers overhead. So everything is arranged in a hierarchy, but the hierarchy has been moved a little bit lower. Christ is showing a book that is open in Latin and Greek. I am the light of the world. So instead of the closed book, we have an open book. And you'll notice that directly below him in the apse is Mary. Normally Mary would be in the conch of the apse, but here Mary, shown as an orant figure, a praying figure with her arms raised, is directly below Christ. She is in the second highest position, and she is flanked by angels who are spiritual beings, so they are able to be in this position. The apostles are then the next level down in rows. And in fact, on either side of the window, sort of the top middle apostles are Peter and Paul, so there's even a kind of hierarchy between them. One of the things that I want to discuss is the style. We have this Byzantine linear style where Christ's draperies become patterns, and he's completely outlined. This Christ Pantocrator at Cefalu is a very elegant Christ. His face is elongated. He has these beautiful lines created with a tesserae that just repeat themselves. And of course this face with this long, thin nose and tiny little mouth beneath the mustache and above the beard. He's shown in a way that you've seen other Christ Pantocrators. He's blessing, and he has the halo with the cross in it. And you can see how very, very linear he is. Even look at the modeling, if you want to call it that, in the neck. There is this pattern that is just made up of lines. When you look at the draperies, they are lines, they are linear forms, they are beautiful patterns, but they essentially are lines. And so here is Christ saying, I am the light of the world. He has his gospel book open so that you can read it. And he blesses. And then you might notice that just below him is Mary. Mary normally would be in the conch of the apse in a Byzantine church, but there is no place for that in a Western-style basilica. So Mary is placed at the next highest level. And she is shown as an orant below Christ. And then the angels are placed on either side of her. These are also heavenly beings. So they are second in height to God, to Christ. Also, you'll notice that the apostles are arranged in rows at the next lower level. And St. Peter, the apostle to the Jews, and St. Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, sort of have prime of place there. They are on the top apostle level, below Mary's level, on either side, sort of in the center, on either side of the window. Another church that's arranged the very similar way is the cathedral at Monreale in the later 12th century, 1174 to 83. And here we look in, and once again we see it's a basilica-type church, but decorated with Byzantine mosaics. You can even see here the timber roof So once again, where are we going to place the Pantocrator? Well, we place it in the highest, most dome-like space we have, which is the conch of the apse. So Christ Pantocrator is the conch of the apse. Mary is one step below, as you can see where the apse curves around directly below Christ. Here she's shown as the Virgin and Child. And she's flanked by angels. And Peter and Paul have been upgraded to the section of the church that's just below Christ. And so you have some of the apostles also. And then the next level down, you have more apostles.